Because when he did this, in 2 days, the world lost $10 trillion of market capitalization. By the way, where did it go? Did it get transferred from here to here? No, it got destroyed. Why destroyed? Because trade, something also the President of the United States doesn't understand, is mutually beneficial. So if you stop trade, everybody loses. It's not that one side wins, the other side loses. He cannot understand that concept as a guy that traded real estate in New York. So his idea is somebody had to win, somebody had to lose. But what happened when he made this announcement...
They want you to believe Donald Trump is too stupid to understand trade. But the truth is much more dangerous for them. Because if Trump is wrong, the elites keep control. If Trump is right, their entire global system collapses. Before we get into this, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support is the only reason we get seen.
If you take your credit card and you go shopping and you run up a large credit card debt, you're running a trade deficit with all those shops. Now, it would be pretty strange if you then blamed all the shop owners for having sold you all those things. You're ripping me off, you're ripping me off, you're ripping me off, I'm running a trade deficit. That is the level of understanding of the President of the United States. The trade deficit does not represent at all trade policies. It represents spending relative to production or earnings. We call that an identity. I teach it in the second day of my course in international monetary economics. Trump never made it to the second day. So he says, you're running a trade deficit. Look, they're all cheating me. But all that's happening is the United States is outspending its national income. And you can look at the national income chart. You can add up consumption and investment and government spending, and you could subtract off gross national product, and lo and behold, what will that equal? Not approximately, exactly. That will equal the current account deficit, which is the comprehensive measure of how much you spend on goods and services versus how much you sell in goods and services. So the United States runs a current account deficit because it spends more than it produces. Why does it do that? We have a big credit card in the United States. It's called the national government. The US government spends about $2 trillion a year more than it takes in revenues. What it's doing is making transfers to the American people and to American businesses. It doesn't tax Americans for those transfers because, here's another little fact, because the congressmen that vote on the budget got into office by being paid for their campaigns by rich people who don't like taxes. So the political system says spend, but don't tax us. So we run a chronic deficit in the United States. That spending goes out either as transfer payments or goods and services, and that's more than our national income, which is about $30 trillion, and our spending is about $31 trillion. And that's our trade deficit. And for that, Donald Trump blames the world. Okay, I fail him for this if he were my student. He's my president. It's a little weirder because when he did this, in 2 days, the world lost $10 trillion of market capitalization. By the way, where did it go? Did it get transferred from here to here? No. It got destroyed. Why destroyed? Because trade, something also the President of the United States doesn't understand, is mutually beneficial. So if you stop trade, everybody loses. It's not that one side wins, the other side loses. He cannot understand that concept as a guy that traded real estate in New York. So his idea is somebody had to win, somebody had to lose. But what happened when he made this announcement was $10 trillion was wiped out worldwide. It's not that the US went up and they went down. No, everybody went down. Because the whole world system is based on a division of labor, and he's breaking that division of labor into pieces. So then people said, this doesn't make sense. Even the very rich people that gave him the money for him to get into office started saying this doesn't make sense. The hedge fund managers who were his big campaign contributors, Elon Musk, who paid for his election, became prime minister. He said this doesn't make sense. And then the markets said this doesn't make sense. Not only $10 trillion, but as the finance minister said, interest rates started to rise because people began to dump U.S. Treasury debt.
The safest thing in the world, apparently.
So, interesting what happened. It's not quite true that he reversed things. First, he left on this 10% tariff, except for one country, for China,
145%
where he
on some
raised
products.
the tariff rates. That's because the United States has a deep, neurotic attachment to China. The U.S. political system hates China. Why? Because China's big and successful. And so that the U.S. hates. It's a rival, it's a competitor, and so this is the one thing he left on. Now he's going to mess up everything with this too, because in a trade war between the U.S. and China, China wins. China does not depend on the U.S. market very much. It's about 12% of China's exports. China will do just fine. It's just dumb policy. There's no more, sorry to say it, there's just no more explanation to this than that. It makes no sense. Now, it raises, if I could, just one last point. How can this happen when it makes no sense? And that, people should understand, we are in one-person rule in the United States. Our political system is in a state of collapse. What President Trump did is an emergency decree. Everything he does is an emergency decree. Literally, you can go on to whitehouse.gov and then follow the menu to executive decrees. And there are dozens of them. And each one starts the same way. With the powers invested in me as President of the United States, I hereby declare A, nonsense, B, nonsense, C, nonsense. Because he's king. Those powers are not invested in the President of the United States. They're invested in the Congress. You read Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution. It says that all duties originate with the Congress. And specifically in the lower house, all legislation has to start in the House of Representatives. But the U.S., starting in 1945 after World War II, became a military state to a large extent. And so it sprinkled in its legislation emergency, emergency, emergency. And Trump doesn't have to prove anything's an emergency, he just has to say something's an emergency. So suddenly the trade deficit became an emergency, and on that basis he issues a one-person rule. Even his aides don't know what he's doing. You raise one final interesting issue, which is that the market recovered about $4 trillion when he reversed. Anyone who knew that 5 minutes before made billions. This is not the cleanest government in the world, I can tell you. I'd be hugely surprised if some people didn't know just a bit ahead of time, starting with members of the US Congress, by the way.
Look, we'll get into the more general issues about protectionism and the end of globalization, question mark, in a minute. But I think what's happening and the directives coming from the White House is such a perfect example of what this panel is about. I'd just like to stay on this just for a few more minutes. Minister, is protectionism always a short-term aim, and does it always come at the expense of the longer-term gain? Donald Trump hasn't said it in public, but apparently in private, during his first term, he was asked about the problem of the US national debt. And his answer was, I don't care because I'll be dead by the time it's a problem. And apparently that's also his approach to the climate crisis. So is this protectionism coming from the White House a short-term fix which is going to hurt America in the longer term in terms of how it grows?
It's not a fix. It's apparently a quick fix, but it's fundamentally flawed, as Professor has very clearly stated. Look, protectionism is nothing new. If you look at post-global financial crisis, the number of annual trade restrictions have gone up dramatically. In fact, like last year, there were over 3,200 trade restrictions. That is almost 11 times higher than what it was pre-global financial crisis. So this has been a trend, but what we have seen over the past week or two is clearly a new level. This goes beyond some protectionist measures, trade restrictions. This goes into something, an all-out trade war. So that's really worrisome, because if you go back, again, if you look at 20 years to global financial crisis, global annual trade growth was 2 times world real GDP growth rate. So in a way, trade was the engine of growth. Mm-hmm. Now that engine has been slow. So if you look at post-global financial crisis, global trade growth barely kept up with real GDP, global GDP growth. So that's no longer really one of the kind of like a strong engine. But I think the way things are now, if current state of affairs is sustained, we may end up actually protectionism dragging global growth. It is not only growth, it's really, there are many, additional fallouts from this type of policies.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So the answer to your question, this is not a fix. This is a fundamentally flawed, policy perspective. Obviously, countries have choice. They always have a choice. But we would rather, see world moving back to rule-based, multilateral framework, where everyone benefits. I think I agree with Professor. Over 1 billion people since 1990s have been lifted out of poverty, predominantly in Asia. I'm talking about absolute poverty here. And that's largely thanks to, trade and growth associated with that trade. So it is worrisome that we are now experimenting policies that may actually reverse some of these gains, which I think were very important. 1 billion people out of absolute poverty cannot be underestimated. It's quite significant. Now, admittedly, trade do cause geographic dislocations, but the solution is not protectionism. The solution lies more internal sound policies, structural remedies, but also you can deploy tax policy incentives and other things to address, dislocations in regions caused by, global trade openness. So it's not a level, but protectionism will create more inequalities. It will create bigger problems. Already you've got significant headwinds for global growth. Aging population, high global indebtedness, impending climate crisis. So protectionism is going to be yet another big blow to long-term growth outlook. And that's why growth is barely, sustained at 3%. I think the risk is that we will move to a new era where
Jeffrey Sachs just went public and said he would fail Donald Trump as a student on trade. Think about that for a second. Not disagree with, not offer an alternative, but fail. That tells you everything you need to know about how the global elite views voters who supported America First. Sachs' entire argument boils down to this: America's trade deficit is our own fault, and blaming other countries is ignorant. He compares it to running up a credit card and blaming the store. Sounds clever. Sounds academic. Sounds completely disconnected from reality. Because the American people are not a reckless shopper with a credit card. The American people are workers in a rigged global system where multinational corporations ship jobs overseas. Foreign governments subsidize their industries, manipulate currencies, and then flood U.S. markets while American workers get left behind. Sachs insists trade is always mutually beneficial. That's textbook theory. In the real world, trade deals are negotiated by governments with power, leverage, and strategic goals. China doesn't trade like a free market democracy. It trades like a state-run empire. And pretending otherwise is either naive or dishonest. He laughs at the idea of bilateral trade imbalances, saying it's insane to care who you're running deficits with. Funny how it's never insane when American factories close, towns collapse, and entire regions become economic wastelands. That cost never shows up on his charts. Then comes the real mask-off moment. Sachs admits the global markets lost trillions when Trump announced tariffs. And that's exactly the point. Wall Street panicked because Trump disrupted a system that was designed to benefit investors, hedge funds, and global supply chains, not American sovereignty. He calls Trump's actions crazy, delusional, even says the U.S. is becoming a rogue nation. Translation: Trump refused to obey the rules written by unelected international bureaucrats and economists who've never missed a paycheck. Sachs also claims China would win a trade war. That's been the threat for decades. And yet China's economy is slowing, their demographics are collapsing, and they still rely heavily on access to Western markets and technology. The idea that America must stay weak to survive is elite fear propaganda. What really terrifies Sachs isn't bad economics. It's the idea that a president would put national interest above global approval. That Congress, the WTO, and the so-called rules-based order might not be the final authority anymore. This debate isn't about trade deficits. It's about control. Do policies serve American citizens, or do they serve a global system where America pays the costs and everyone else takes the gains? Trump challenged that system. And the reaction from people like Jeffrey Sachs proves he hit the target. Let me know what you think in the comments. Is Trump wrong on trade, or are the so-called experts just mad they're losing power? Like the video, subscribe to Stateline, and I'll see you in the next one.